Hey guys, tonight we begin with a quiet story of one man alone with the wild for decades. So dim the lights, pull the blanket up and settle in. We're going to float through the life of Frank Glaser. Yes, the so-called Wolfman of Alaska. Because why not dive into a guy who traded civilization for the forest, wolves and endless snow? No rush, no thunderous action, just a man, the wild, and lots of cold nights. Frank arrived in Alaska in 1915, aged about 26. He came from somewhere in the lower 48, the contiguous United States, with a pack, a rifle, and a fair amount of gumption. Outdoor life +2, mountain press +2. The Alaska he entered was vast, untamed and often indifferent, which was part of the appeal. He walked from Valdez up toward Fairbanks, covering hundreds of miles on foot. Outdoor life. He became a trapper, a market hunter, a dog team freighter, a wolf dog breeder, roadhouse owner, predator control agent. Outdoor life +1 in short, a jack of many wilderness trades. But beneath the titles lies a man who chose solitude. Long stretches away from towns, cabins, roads, the gentle hum of civilization. Because of course he did. Now when we say over 40 years, yes, that's a long time. He spent 4 decades, 1915-1955, trekking, trapping, hunting, dog sledding, and simply inhabiting the wild spaces of Alaska. Mountain Press +1. What follows is not a thrilling adventure tale, though there were thrills, but a slow glide through his life. His routines, the oddities, the dark nights, the wolf howls, and the quiet that only the wilderness can provide. Let's start with his early days. He arrived with ambition. He wanted big game, caribou, moose, Dall sheep, the sort of animals that loom large in Alaska lore. He wanted to trap fox, lynx, marten. He wanted to test himself. In his first season in 1915, he made that walk from Valdez to Fairbanks, 371 miles on foot. Outdoor life upon arrival. He began working at roadhouses and for the road crews building what became the Richardson Highway. Outdoor life +1 he shaded into the category of sourdough, those old Alaska veterans, and he soon earned a reputation among other wildlife folks, trapper hunting folks, and indigenous people. The nickname Wolfman comes partly from his wolf dog breeding, his deep knowledge of wolves, and his role as a predator control agent. Outdoor life +1, the solitude suited him. He often lived in cabins or remote posts, tied to dog teams and sleds rather than cars and highways. He became Silent Frank in some circles, though of course long stretches of solitude make a man quieter. Outdoor life one early habit. Caching meat on glaciers, carrying out sheep and caribou, living off minimal supplies. For example, in 1915 he shot 2 rams. One he cached on a glacier because he couldn't pack it out before spoilage. Outdoor life, the wilderness never paused for convenience. He adapted. So picture this. Vast mountains, icy ridges, creeks, rivers, wolf packs echoing in the night, spruce forests, snow, cold. Frank walked into this not as a tourist, but as someone who planned to stay, for years, for decades. Let's float over to another phase of his life, where things deepen, the wolf dogs, the remote cabins, the near-death crossings. Frank's relationship with wolves wasn't simple man versus beast. He studied them, ran dog teams partly made of wolf-dog hybrids, bred them, listened to their howls. Outdoor life +1, for instance. His dog Queenie, a wolf dog, would howl to draw wolves in. One story. Queenie howled, the wild wolves answered, came closer and closer, and Frank laid in wait with his rifle. Outdoor life. The nuance, he respected wolves even as he hunted them. That contradiction sits easily in the wilderness world. Consider a moment. He was out hunting wolves in the Mount Hayes region, Alaska Range. A big grizzly charged him. He was using a .220 Swift rifle. Weird choice for a grizzly, yes. and it took 11 shots to finally drop the bear. He then hiked out over 100 miles, broken through river ice in -40 BAF. Okay, -40 degrees has no degree F distinction, but you get the idea. Outdoor life. He walked out wet, freezing, stripped to dry his clothes by the fire. No drama, just a diary-like recounting. Had a hell of a time crossing the river. Outdoor life, that's what life in the wild had become. Not heroism for spectacle, but survival for rhythm. He cached meat, skinned animals, sewed hides into clothing and sleeping bags, walked alone for days. In one migration assignment in 1937, at age 48, he followed the 40-mile caribou herd on foot, made a sleeping bag out of about 3 yearling caribou hides, and used it for years. Outdoor life lets pause on the wolf-dog hybrid idea, because it's quietly weird and compelling. Queenie was part wolf, part Malamute, bred by Frank. She howled to lure wild wolves. Frank watched from his cabin, rifle across his lap as wolves crept closer, sometimes within 50 yards. He even said he counted 27 wolves strung across the ice once. Outdoor life, one image. A hunting man, a wolf dog, and a wild wolf pack all howling in the cold. And a man who silently watches, waits, acts. This life of risk, solitude, and daily grind, it changed a person. The wild doesn't care if you're bored, sad, tired, it just is. Frank stayed because he had the skills, the drive, and perhaps the detachment from the mainstream world. Over time, he became legend among Alaskan hunters for his nonchalant attitude toward hardship. He nearly drowned by breaking into a river, froze, survived, and wrote it off with casual words. Outdoor life, so here we are, man, dog, wolves, wilderness. Not glamorous, just enduring. Let's drift over to his middle years. The roadhouses, the changing Alaska, the predator control assignments. As Frank aged, his roles shifted. He wasn't just trapping for himself anymore. He operated roadhouses, inns for bush travelers, supplied meat to crews building roads. He served as a federal predator control agent, yes, government work in the wild. Outdoor life +1. So the solitary man ironically became part of a system, though still in the wild. At the Black Rapids Roadhouse, he supplied meat to crews building the Richardson Highway. Outdoor life +1. He also had decades of knowledge about wolves and wildlife, so biologists came to consult him. Outdoor life +1. The world around him changed. Roads extended, mechanization advanced, civilization seeped further into Alaska. Yet Frank stayed in his groove. Dog teams, sleds, backpacks, caches, solitude. There are subtle emotional notes. Living remote is lonely. Companion animals, his dogs, matter. The wild offers no applause, no guarantee of return, no internet. The rhythm is day in, day out, trap, hunt, dog team, sled, snow, frost. In his biography, he seemed at peace with it. He adapted. He survived. He thrived in his own way. Yet sometimes you sense weariness. The near deaths, the constant risk, the cold nights. The wilderness isn't kind. And the man who chooses it must accept the bargain. Quiet isolation, hardship, occasionally wonder. Over 40 years, that bargain becomes habit. The guy becomes part of the land as much as it is part of him. One symbolic image, caching a sheep ram on a glacier, making a sleeping bag from caribou hides, wrestling with a grizzly over snow, sleeping in a cabin far from towns, waiting for supplies, using dog teams while others used trucks. Frank was from a fading breed. He survived because he embraced the ancient rhythm. Let's lean into his final decades, how his legend formed, his reflections, and the legacy in the wild. By the time the mid-1950s rolled around, Frank had logged 4 decades of Alaskan wildlife. His stories became folklore among Alaskan hunters and trappers. The book Alaska's Wolfman by Jim Reardon tells his story. The 1915-55 wilderness adventures of Frank Glaser. Mountain Press Pull 1. In his later years, he still talked about the old days. The walks, the dog teams, the wolves. Others in the mountains said, "That's old Frank up there, his legacy is complex." On one hand, he hunted wolves, was a predator control agent, shot bears, sheep, caribou. On the other, he respected the wild, listened to wolves, bred wolf dogs, taught younger hunters about the land. He was anchored in his time, yet walking alongside change. Some roads came in, new technologies emerged. Alaska shifted from frontier to more connected. But Frank remained in his rhythm. We can draw some gentle lessons from his life. Not moral lessons, more reflections. Solitude isn't always loneliness. Sometimes it's clarity. Hardship becomes background noise. At one point he wrote, "Had a hell of a time crossing the river. That's it. Flat, matter of fact. Outdoor life respect for wild creatures, wolves. Bears, caribou can coexist with hunting and survival. Time in the wilderness changes you. Not always for the better, not always for the worse. Just changed." As listeners drift off tonight, picture Frank on some ridge in the Alaska range. Snow falling. The wind like a low sigh through spruce. His dog team huddled, the wolves howling somewhere in the dark. He sits by the fire, boots kicked aside, preparing for the next day's trek. No fanfare. No audience. Just another dawn in the wild. And so we gently close this part of the story. Not with a roar, not with fireworks, but with a pause. A breath, a chill. The wilderness unchanging, the man enduring. We will continue in the next segment, where we'll explore more deeply some of his odd habits, the personal costs, the final walks out of the deep wild, and what became of the Wolfman legacy. Hey again, still awake? You might want to loosen that blanket and settle a little deeper. We're going to wander through the middle years of Frank Glaser's life, the decades when the wild wasn't just where he lived, but what he was. By now it's the early 1920s. Alaska's still rough around the edges, trails more than roads, maps that fade into blank space, and mail that might arrive once every few months if the river ice behaved. And Frank? He's about 30-something, lean, quiet, and thoroughly done with what most people would call normal living. He's got his dogs, his rifle, and his cabin somewhere in the white emptiness. And if you're picturing some cheerful pioneer cabin scene, don't. Think more a single-room log shelter. Stove always going. Snow drifted up the walls. The kind of place where the silence itself has weight. The wolf dog Queenie. Let's start with Queenie. Because if any creature shaped Frank's life out there, it was her. Queenie wasn't a pure dog. She was half wolf, half husky, bred from the kind of idea that only makes sense if you live 100 miles from your nearest neighbor. Frank bred wolf dogs not for the novelty, but because they worked. They were smarter than most dogs, tougher than sled breeds, and, inconveniently, just wild enough to cause chaos when bored. Queenie was his favorite. Now Queenie had a hobby. Howling, a simple enough pastime, except that when Queenie howled, the wild wolves would answer back. Every night. Like a back-and-forth radio conversation, across miles of frozen air. Frank used to step outside his cabin when she started, stand there in the cold, and listen to the replies echo through the valleys. Sometimes he'd count the voices. 6, 8, maybe a dozen. And if the pack came close enough, well, that was when the wolfman part of his life really showed. He studied them, watched how they moved, how they hunted, how they survived when the temperature dropped to numbers you don't even want to imagine. And sometimes, yes, he hunted them too, because Alaska had rules back then. Wolves were seen as competitors for game, so the government paid bounty. Frank, ever practical, took the job seriously, but he never saw it as personal. When he described wolves later, it was almost with admiration, calling them the smartest animals in the north. You can feel it in his writing, the respect, the fascination, the strange affection. This was a man who lived close enough to the food chain that moral lines blurred. You could both hunt and love the same creature. The wolf hunts one winter in the Alaska range. Queenie was doing her usual nighttime duet with the wild pack. Frank, curious, grabbed his rifle and followed her tracks out onto the frozen creek. The air was brittle. Every breath turned into a puff of frost. Somewhere out there the wolves were closing in, drawn by Queenie's calls. Frank later said he counted 27 wolves that night. 27 grey shapes slipping through the half-moon light, silent as mist. Imagine that, the cold, the quiet, the faint crunch of paws on snow, and a man standing still, rifle ready, just watching. He didn't always shoot. Sometimes he just observed. He wanted to learn wolves, their patterns, habits, routes. He said wolves taught him more about Alaska than any map. And that's the thing about Frank. For all his rough, solitary reputation, he wasn't really fighting the wilderness. He was listening to it, living in it like a part of the system, not an intruder. He once said, "You can't beat the country. You work with it or you leave," which is both wise and slightly depressing. The endless miles most winters, Frank trapped along a route that stretched hundreds of miles, alone. No radio, no backup, no phone. If something went wrong, frostbite, a broken leg, thin ice, that was it, and things did go wrong. There's one story, very casually told in his notes, where he fell through a river in -40 weather. Just slipped right in. He managed to crawl out, strip off his frozen clothes and light a fire before his body shut down. Then he stayed up all night feeding that fire, rotating his boots to keep them from turning into boards. He didn't tell that story like a man who nearly died. More like a man describing a slightly annoying Tuesday. "Had a hell of a time crossing the river," he wrote. That's it. No panic, no heroics. Just another day. That was Frank's rhythm: danger, survival, calm. Over and over for decades. When you think about it, he lived in a kind of slow-motion danger loop. Nothing dramatic, just the constant possibility of freezing, starving, or being eaten. And yet he kept going. Not because he loved risk, he didn't seem to care about that at all, but because he didn't want anything else. His cabins and daily life. Frank built dozens of cabins over his life, small, log huts scattered across the interior of Alaska. He never stayed long in one place. When the fur ran out, he moved. Inside his cabins, everything had a purpose. A stove in the corner, an oil lamp, shelves made of rough boards, a bunk with caribou hides for bedding, a pot of something, usually beans or dried meat stew, simmering slowly. He kept his traps in order, his rifles oiled, and his sled gear hung neatly. The man might live like a hermit, but he had standards. And always the dogs. 10, maybe 12 of them, lined up outside, curled in the snow. They were his company, his transport, and occasionally his warmth. If the temperature dropped too far, he'd sleep with 1 or 2 in the cabin. Not romantic, just practical. You can't be picky about comfort at 50 below. His days followed a quiet rhythm. Up before dawn, check traps, skin what he caught, cook, mend. Write a few notes in his small, cramped handwriting. Sleep early. He wasn't isolated in the tragic sense. He was contentedly separate. Civilization didn't offer him much. Noise, crowds, talk. None of it useful when you've got sled dogs and silence. A man and his silence. People who met Frank in town, on his rare trips for supplies, described him as polite, quiet, and slightly awkward. Like someone who'd forgotten the choreography of conversation, he didn't boast about his hunts, didn't tell tall tales. If someone asked how his winter went, he'd shrug and say, "Fine," which could mean anything from "I nearly froze solid" to "I walked 500 miles and fought a bear." It's the kind of understatement only decades alone can teach. Frank's silence wasn't empty, though. It was full of things. The memory of wind on ridges, the smell of spruce fires, the sound of wolves at night. When you live 40 years alone in wild country, you start measuring time differently. Not by days, but by seasons. Not by birthdays, but by migrations, encounters and observations. Every once in a while he'd meet someone out there, a prospector, another trapper, or occasionally an Athabascan hunter. They'd share a meal, talk about snow conditions, then drift apart again. Frank learned a lot from native hunters: how to travel light, how to read the ice, how to keep going in weather that kills careless people. He respected them deeply, though he was too reserved to say so out loud. His notes mention one lesson that stuck: don't fight the cold. Dress for it, walk in it, and forget about it. Simple, practical. Perfectly Frank the Grizzly incident now. There's one story that always gets mentioned. And yes, it sounds ridiculous, but it's true. Frank once found himself face to face with a massive grizzly bear. The problem? He was carrying a .220 Swift, a small caliber rifle meant for coyotes and foxes, not several hundred pounds of angry fur. Most people would have run. Frank didn't. He just started shooting. 11 times. By the time the bear finally went down, Frank had used every round he had. Then he dressed the carcass, built a fire, and calmly made dinner. When asked about it later, he just said, "It was a mistake to be carrying the Swift," which is the understatement of the century. The wolf dog experiment's Queenie wasn't his only wolf dog. Over the years, Frank bred several lines. Some worked well for sledding, others were too wild. He discovered that first-generation hybrids were unpredictable, sometimes loyal, sometimes pure chaos. He said they'd pull all day and eat the harness at night. Still, he preferred them. They had endurance. They didn't tire easily, and they seemed to sense danger before he did. Once, one of his wolf dogs refused to cross a frozen river. Frank got annoyed until he noticed the faint cracks under the ice. A minute later, the section collapsed. The dog saved his life. That's the kind of relationship he had with animals. Mutual, unsentimental respect. He didn't talk to them like pets. They were partners. The economy of survival people sometimes imagines solitude as a kind of poetic experience. For Frank, it was mostly logistics. Every pound of flour, every bullet, every match had to be earned, hauled, and rationed. He calculated his needs like an accountant. 1 pound of beans, 2 days of meals, 1 gallon of fuel oil, maybe a week of light. When supplies ran low, he'd hitch up the dogs and travel to the nearest settlement, sometimes 100 miles or more, to trade furs for goods. Then he'd disappear again for another season. He didn't need much. He'd fix his own boots, mend his own clothes, make new traps from scrap wire. If something broke, he didn't throw it away. He adapted it. In a world of infinite replacement, that might sound quaint. In Alaska, it was survival. The quiet between storms. It's hard to explain what the wilderness silence is like. It's not peaceful, not exactly. It's complete. The kind of silence where your heartbeat sounds loud, and even your breath feels intrusive. Frank lived inside that silence for years. He said it gets into you and then you miss it when it's gone. Every evening he'd light his stove, melt snow for water, and sit by the fire. Outside, wolves called. Inside, only the soft pop of resin in the burning spruce. You can imagine him there, eyes half closed, Queenie sleeping by the door, snow pressing against the window logs. That quiet was his company, and somehow it was enough. Lessons from the wild over time, Frank became an unintentional biologist. He noticed migration patterns before scientists did. He recorded when caribou herds shifted, when lynx populations crashed, when snowshoe hares multiplied. When government agents finally started asking about predator control in the 1930s, Frank's field notes became valuable. He knew where wolves denned, how they hunted, how they survived starvation winters. He wasn't romantic about it. When someone once called wolves evil, he corrected them. They're just trying to eat. Same as us. It's hard to argue with that when you've spent half your life sharing a food chain with them. The strange kind of freedom. So why did he do it? Why live alone for 40 years? People asked. But Frank never gave a grand answer. He just said he liked it better that way. No bosses, no crowds, no clocks. Maybe that was enough. In a world obsessed with progress, he was quietly opting out, choosing frostbite over deadlines, wolves over neighbors, silence over small talk, and maybe, deep down, he knew he'd never fit comfortably back in civilization again. Once you've listened to the wind howl across 50 miles of tundra, the sound of traffic probably feels ridiculous. Closing the night by the late 1930s, Frank was in his 50s. Most men that age were settling down. Frank was still mushing dogs through blizzards, still checking traps, still cooking beans on an oil stove. The younger trappers called him the Old Wolf Man, not mockingly, respectfully. Because somehow through storms, floods, near-freezing, bear attacks and loneliness, he kept going. It wasn't adventure anymore. It was just life. And so as we drift out of this chapter, picture him again, sitting by the fire, mending a harness, while Queenie lifts her head to the sound of distant howls. He listens, smiles a little and mutters, "They're still out there." Then he adds another log to the fire, leans back, and lets the silence fill the room. Because for Frank Glaser, Alaska's wolfman, that silence wasn't emptiness. It was home. Hey guys, still here? Still half awake? Good. Because the story's about to drift into that weird space between wilderness and civilization. The part of Frank Glaser's life where he accidentally became an employee of the US government. Now, if you've been living alone for 20 years, trapping and talking mostly to wolf dogs, the idea of government work sounds hilarious. But that's exactly what happened. The man who could go months without seeing another human somehow ended up with a federal job title, because of course he did. The shift from solitude to service by the 1930s, Alaska was changing. The Great Depression had people looking north for work. Roads were being pushed into the interior. Planes were flying over what had once been blank space. The quiet frontier was getting crowded. Well, crowded in the Alaskan sense, meaning you might see another person once a week instead of once a month. Frank wasn't thrilled, but he adapted. When the territory needed experienced woodsmen to help with predator control, reducing wolf and coyote, populations that preyed on caribou and livestock, his name came up. Fast, he'd spent decades learning wolf behavior. He knew where they denned when they moved, how they thought. So they hired him. Officially, he was a predator control agent for the U.S. Biological Survey. Unofficially, he was still Frank, a man with frost in his beard and wolf hairs on his parka, who treated government bureaucracy like another kind of weather, unavoidable, mildly irritating, and eventually survivable. Life at Black Rapids Roadhouse before full government work. Frank had already been supplying meat to construction crews on the Richardson Highway, Alaska's first major road. The Black Rapids Roadhouse sat along that trail, halfway between Valdez and Fairbanks. It was one of those outposts that served everything. Part hotel, part tavern, part trading post, and part rumor factory. Frank managed it for a while, which is kind of funny, because he wasn't exactly a hospitality person. But he was dependable, and his cooking didn't kill anyone, which in the bush counts as 5-star service. Imagine it, truck drivers, dog team mail carriers, and cold, half-frozen travelers stumbling in from the blizzard. And behind the counter, silent, wiry Frank, ladling out moose stew like it's the Eucharist, he kept things running. Hunted meat, chopped wood, fixed sleds. In winter, He'd still disappear for days on hunting trips, leaving a note. Gone for meat. Back later. Guests would sometimes find his wolf dogs tied outside, waiting patiently, half asleep in the snow. The roadhouse gave him just enough human contact to stay half civilized. But even then, he mostly preferred the back trails. He wasn't built for small talk. He was built for snow and silence. The world modernizes. Frank shrugs. By the late 1930s, planes were dropping mail. Snow machines were being invented. Hunters were buying repeating rifles and gasoline lanterns. Frank noticed all this and, as usual, wasn't impressed. He still trusted his dogs, his kerosene lamp, and his snowshoes. A younger trapper once asked him, "Why don't you get a plane like the others?" Frank supposedly replied, "Because I don't have wings." And that was that. He preferred things he could fix himself. Planes crash, motors freeze. Dogs don't need gasoline. He'd watch bush pilots skim overhead, little dots against the mountain sky, and shake his head like a man watching teenagers ruin everything. The predator control years. When Frank joined the Biological Survey, it wasn't glamorous. His job was to track wolves, locate dens, and remove predators from certain regions to protect the dwindling caribou herds. It sounds grim, and in many ways it was. But Frank approached it like science. He studied the animals first. He didn't hate wolves, far from it. He called them the cleverest devils that ever walked. He'd set up camp near den sites, often in brutal cold, watching for tracks and listening to the faint howls rolling through valleys. Sometimes he'd spend days belly crawling through snow just to confirm where a pack was living. His reports were oddly poetic for government paperwork, calm, factual, yet filled with admiration. He'd write things like, "Wolf den located on South Slope, well built. Wolves cautious, avoided trapline." Very intelligent. He couldn't help respecting them. To outthink a wolf, you had to become a bit of one yourself. And in many ways, Frank had already crossed that line. The scientist who never went to school, biologists, began to notice him. Real scientists, clipboard people, would come up from Fairbanks to pick his brain. Frank had no formal education beyond high school, but his field experience was gold. He could predict migrations, explain predator behavior, and identify species by tracks most people would miss. They'd ask about wolf packs, and Frank would lean back, maybe crack half a smile and say, "You don't find wolves. They find you." That kind of comment annoyed the clipboard crowd, but they wrote it down anyway. His understanding of ecosystems was intuitive. He observed without romanticizing. If caribou numbers dropped, he noted how wolves shifted diet. When rabbits exploded in population, he knew lynx numbers would follow 2 winters later. He didn't use words like ecology or balance of nature. He just knew. The Long March's government work didn't make things easier. If anything, it gave him longer routes. He was expected to patrol vast stretches of the Alaska Range, often hundreds of miles between settlements. He'd load a sled, harness 10 dogs, and vanish for weeks. No backup. No radio. Just an itinerary written in pencil. Checking South Fork. Back when I'm done. The man didn't just go into the wilderness. He belonged there. He averaged 20 to 30 miles a day, through storms that grounded airplanes. Sometimes after 2 weeks, he'd return with frost in his beard and a bag full of pelts, acting like he'd just gone grocery shopping. When younger trappers complained about the cold, he'd shrug. You dress for it or you freeze. Simple. Which, frankly, should be on an Alaskan flag somewhere. An accidental legend as years passed. Stories about the Wolfman began to circulate. Some true, some wildly exaggerated. As all frontier tales tend to become, people said he could smell wolves miles away, that he once spent an entire winter living inside a snow cave. That he ate raw caribou liver to stay alive, that one's probably true. Frank never corrected anyone. He didn't care about his reputation, good or bad. He'd nod politely when someone called him a legend, then go right back to mending his traps. It's the kind of fame that only solitude produces. The quieter a man is, the louder the legends get. The little odd habits, long isolation leaves its fingerprints. Frank had some quirks, small, harmless, but noticeable. He talked to his dogs more than to people, giving them names like Blue, Rex, Lady, and Old Baldy. He'd mutter weather predictions to them. Like, smells like 20 below tomorrow, eh, Rex? In town, he'd stand awkwardly at the edge of conversations, unsure when to speak. But hand him a rifle or a map, and he became entirely fluent again. He didn't drink much. Alcohol made him too talky, he said, which, for a man who barely spoke, is saying something. He carried a notebook everywhere, filled with weather notes, animal sightings, and little sketches of paw prints. When asked why, he said, "So I can remember what happened in case I forget I was there." Practical, poetic, and slightly existential. Very frank. The little odd habits, long isolation leaves its fingerprints. Frank had some quirks, small, harmless, but noticeable. He talked to his dogs more than to people, giving them names like Blue, Rex, Lady, and Old Baldy. He'd mutter weather predictions to them. Like it smells like 20 below tomorrow, eh, Rex? In town, he'd stand awkwardly at the edge of conversations, unsure when to speak. But hand him a rifle or a map, and he became entirely fluent again. He didn't drink much. Alcohol made him too talky, he said, which, for a man who barely spoke, is saying something. He carried a notebook everywhere, filled with weather notes, animal sightings, and little sketches of paw prints. When asked why, he said, "So I can remember what happened. Fun case I forget I was there." Practical, poetic, and slightly existential, very frank. The Black Rapids flood of 1937, one of the few dramatic events in his roadhouse years, came in 1937, when the Black Rapids Glacier advanced rapidly and threatened the highway. Frank, living nearby, helped evacuate supplies and warned travelers. He described it later as a moving wall of ice, slow but with purpose. Reporters came up from Anchorage writing about the galloping glacier. Frank didn't see what the fuss was about. "Glaciers move," he said. "That's what they do, again, a pure underreaction. A mile-wide glacier rumbling toward civilization, and Frank treats it like a mildly annoying weather event. Government paydays and priorities, working for the Biological Survey, wasn't exactly lucrative. The pay was small, the conditions brutal, and the rules vague. Once he hiked 100 miles to deliver his report to a regional office, only to find they'd moved the office 2 weeks earlier. He shrugged, turned around, and hiked home. He wasn't bitter, just practical. He said, "They pay slow, but the country pays fast, meaning you freeze less if you keep moving." He measured wealth in good boots, healthy dogs, and dry matches. The rest, money, paperwork, recognition, didn't count. The younger generation by the 1940s, younger hunters and rangers were showing up. Men half his age, armed with new technology and government-issued snowmobiles. They admired him, even when they didn't quite understand him. Some tried to emulate his lifestyle. Lasted one winter, maybe two, and then went back to town swearing off solitude forever. Frank never judged them. He just said, "It's not for everyone," which, translated from Frank speak, means you'll probably go insane before spring. He gave advice freely, though. How to cross thin ice, how to recognize a wolf den, how to light a fire in a blizzard. People remembered his lessons decades later. The quiet philosopher. He wasn't a talker, but when he did talk, it stuck with people. One younger ranger recalled asking Frank if he ever got scared. He said, "Sure, but fear's like cold. It goes away if you keep busy." Another time, someone asked what he missed most from civilization. He thought for a long while and finally said, "A hot bath that doesn't smell like smoke." Even his humor was minimalistic. Dry as snow dust. The loneliness question. Everyone asked him eventually, "Didn't you get lonely?" And every time Frank gave the same answer. "Sometimes. But there's worse company than your own." That might sound sad, but it wasn't. It was acceptance. For him, loneliness was just another natural condition like rain or frost. You didn't fight it. You just lived with it until it passed. He once told a friend that silence could be good company if you let it talk first, which, depending on how sleepy you are right now, might actually be profound. The march of time as the 1950s arrived, Alaska was on the cusp of becoming a state. Roads extended farther, towns grew bigger, and airplanes became normal. The frontier was closing. Frank was now in his 60s, but still out there, walking trap lines, feeding dogs, fixing sleds. People couldn't believe it. A man who'd spent 40 years in the wilderness was still strong, still lean, still quietly moving through the snow like part of the landscape. He never wrote a memoir, never sought attention, but biologists, trappers, and hunters told his stories until someone finally gathered them into a book, Alaska's Wolf Man. The final years in the field, even into old age. Frank kept traveling between his favorite ranges, Mount Hayes, the Delta River, the Tanana Valley. He'd revisit old cabins he'd built decades earlier, sometimes finding them half collapsed under snow. He'd patch the roofs, sweep out the dust, and spend a night there just for the memory. There's something deeply peaceful about that image as an old man, alone, repairing his own ghost houses. He never seemed nostalgic, though. When asked if he missed the early days, he said, "No, it's all the same country. Just less quiet now." The legend becomes literature. In the 1970s, long after Frank retired, writer Jim Reardon began collecting his stories. Frank was older, still sharp and still modest. Reardon described him as unimpressed by everything except the weather, which honestly could be his epitaph. They talked for months. Frank told story after story, not heroic, not sensational, just matter-of-fact accounts of what it takes to stay alive when your nearest neighbor is 50 miles away and has fur. Reardon later said the hardest part was getting Frank to admit anything remarkable had ever happened to him. He described walking 100 miles in a blizzard like he was going to the post office, a man out of time. By then, civilization had finally caught up with the wilderness. Snowmobiles replaced sled dogs. Helicopters replaced dog teams for predator patrols. Frank quietly faded into retirement, splitting his time between Fairbanks and the countryside. He never grew bitter about the changes. He just chuckled and said, "The wolves will figure it out," because in his mind the wilderness didn't belong to people anyway. It would survive us all, drifting toward the next chapter. So, as we close this part of the story, imagine Frank sitting by that same small stove, maybe in a slightly newer cabin, the flame flickering against his weathered hands. Outside, the modern world hums faintly, planes overhead, trucks on distant roads. But around him the forest still breathes the same old rhythm. He's older now, slower, but still part of it. The silence still knows his name, and as he listens to one last wolf howl rising from the hills, he smiles, because even after 40 years of solitude, the wild still calls back. In the next part, we'll drift gently into his final years, the reflections, the fading wilderness, and the quiet ending of the Wolfman legend. The snow never stopped falling in Frank Glaser's world. Even when he was living in Fairbanks, surrounded by houses and cars, his mind still drifted back to the hush of the wilderness, that great white stillness where he'd spent most of his life. In his later years, people often asked him how it felt to grow old after so many winters out there. He'd give the same dry half-smile and say, "Feels about the same. Just takes longer to thaw out in the morning." That was Frank, still practical, still funny in that understated way that only comes from surviving things most people can't even imagine. The world catches up by the late 1950s. Alaska was on the verge of statehood. Roads carved their way deeper into the wilderness. Radio towers blinked in places that once belonged only to ravens, and the great silence that had once wrapped the land began to thin. Frank was in his 60s now, though he didn't look it. Years of cold and movement had preserved him the way the snow preserves a fallen branch, lean, solid, weathered but unbroken. He'd retired from official predator control work, but retirement didn't mean rest for him. It simply meant no more government reports. He still roamed the trails near Delta Junction and the Alaska Range. He still fixed his sleds, still tended to his dogs, still kept that same small notebook in his coat pocket, the one filled with weather notes, sketches, and small, unimportant miracles. The land that had once been his quiet companion was changing fast. Airplanes buzzed overhead. Tourists began to arrive, dressed in bright nylon and optimism, taking pictures of the very mountains that had once nearly killed him. Frank didn't resent it. He just shook his head, a little amused, and said, "They'll learn. The country teaches everyone sooner or later." The passing of an era, the old-timers were fading away. Men who had come north in the 1910s and 1920s, gold prospectors, mail carriers, trappers, dog drivers, they were all getting older, moving south, or simply disappearing quietly into the snow. The wilderness that had once been vast and wild enough to swallow a man whole was slowly being mapped, fenced and photographed. Frank was, in many ways, one of the last of them. A living memory of a time when Alaska had no paved roads, and the word neighbor meant someone 50 miles away. Sometimes he'd visit the Black Rapids Roadhouse, now more of a highway stop than a frontier outpost. He'd sit by the window with a cup of coffee, staring out toward the white ridges of the Delta Mountains, and say softly, "Used to be wolves out there. Now it's just trucks, not bitter, just quietly observant, like a man watching a tide he always knew would come in someday." Stories finally told in the 1970s, a writer and historian named Jim Reardon came to see him. Reardon had heard the legends of the man who lived alone among wolves, who could travel 100 miles through a blizzard and come back with nothing but frost in his beard and a calm smile. He found Frank living modestly in Fairbanks, in a small cabin, surrounded by the sort of clutter you collect over a lifetime. Wolf skulls, snowshoes, worn dog harnesses, yellowing notebooks. Reardon was immediately struck by his manner. There was no swagger, no grand storytelling energy. Frank spoke quietly, factually, like a man giving a weather report. Reardon would later say, he made extraordinary things sound ordinary, which somehow made them even more extraordinary. For months they talked. Frank shared his memories bit by bit, sometimes over coffee, sometimes while sharpening tools or feeding his dogs. He didn't dramatize anything. When Reardon asked how he'd survived those early years alone, Frank simply said, "Kept busy. Traps don't set themselves." When asked about loneliness, he said, "You only feel alone if you expect company." Reardon realized he was listening not just to a trapper, but to a philosopher of silence. Those conversations would later become the backbone of the book Alaska's Wolfman, published in 1998, long after Frank had passed away. It remains one of the most vivid portraits of life in the Alaskan wild ever written, not because of heroics, but because of its quiet honesty, the strange peace of stillness in his later years. Frank slowed down, though slowed for him still meant walking several miles a day. He'd check the river ice, feed stray dogs, fix neighbors' sleds. Sometimes, on mild winter evenings, he'd take a short sled run with just 2 dogs, more out of habit than necessity. The rhythm of runners over snow was like breathing to him. People in Fairbanks began to recognize the old man with the wolfish dogs. They'd see him walking down the road in his heavy parka and nod respectfully. He rarely stopped to chat, but when he did, he was kind. Simple conversations about weather, the moon, or the condition of the trails. To the younger generation, he was something of a relic, a living link to a harsher, simpler world that most of them had only read about. The wolves come back ironically. Just as Frank grew older, wolves began returning to areas they'd been driven out of. Predator control policies softened. Scientists began to talk about ecological balance, reintroduction, and respect for apex predators. It was almost poetic. The world that once feared and hunted wolves had begun to admire them, right when the man who'd spent his life studying them was nearing his end. When asked what he thought about that, Frank said, "Good, they belong here. Always did," and he meant it. He'd never seen wolves as enemies. He hunted them because the job required it, but he respected them deeply, saw in them something of himself, solitary, intelligent, surviving not by dominance but by awareness. He once told a friend, "If you watch a wolf long enough, you start to understand people. They chase, they circle, they rest. Then they chase again." A line that could have come straight out of a Zen proverb, except it was said by a man in a fur parka sharpening a trap spring. The last cabin as old age crept in. Frank spent more and more time indoors, something that had never suited him. Friends said he'd sit by the stove for hours, watching the flames as if they were campfires from all his past winters, flickering back to life. Sometimes he'd reach down and pat the head of an old husky dozing at his feet and whisper something like, "Not much trail left now, eh, boy?" But he didn't seem sad and just patient. He'd lived long enough to see both the wilderness and civilization change places. He'd seen men arrive unprepared, leave broken, and the land itself remain unbothered. In his final years, his eyesight faded. His hearing too, but he never lost his sense of calm. When a friend worried about him living alone, he said, "I've been alone longer than most folks have been alive." He passed quietly, as he'd lived, without fuss or ceremony. The exact date varies depending on the source, but it was in the late 1970s in Alaska, his home until the end. No grand funeral, no headlines. Just another snowfall on another long northern night, the afterglow of a life well lived. After his death, the stories spread wider. Biologists cited him in studies. Historians called him one of the last true wilderness men. But to those who'd met him, his legacy wasn't about toughness or hunting or even survival. It was about presence. Frank embodied something rare, a kind of peace that comes only from complete self-reliance. He didn't conquer the wild. He became part of it. He wasn't running from society. He wasn't chasing glory. He was simply living where he felt at home. In an age obsessed with speed and noise, that kind of stillness feels almost sacred. And maybe that's why his story endures, because it reminds us that silence, patience and solitude are not punishments, but gifts. The landscape remembers if you travel today through the Alaska Range, especially near the Delta River or Black Rapids. The air still carries traces of his world. The old trapline trails are faint now, swallowed by moss and snow. The cabins, some half-collapsed, some standing stubbornly, still hold the scent of wood smoke and wolf fur. In winter, when the wind dies down and the moonlight hits the snow just right, you can imagine a thin trail cutting across the valley, sled runners whispering, Dog paws thudding softly. No sound of engines. No chatter. Just the rhythm of a man and his dogs moving through endless white. That's where Frank Glaser still lives. Not in history books. Not in museums, but in the quiet between the mountains. In that timeless hush where breath and snow become the same thing. The meaning of solitude, Frank once said, "You don't really own anything out there. You just borrow it until spring." He wasn't talking about land or cabins. He meant life itself. Everything from warmth to daylight is temporary, something you hold gently until it's gone. It's a simple philosophy, but it explains how he managed to live 40 years in the wild without losing himself. He never fought the world. He moved with it. Where others saw danger, he saw rhythm. Where others heard silence, he heard language. And where others sought comfort, he sought truth, even if that truth was cold, lonely, and hidden under 6 feet of snow. The Wolfman's legacy today, Frank Glaser is remembered not as a hunter or a recluse, but as a listener. He listened to the land long enough to understand it. He watched animals long enough to respect them. And he lived long enough to see people rediscover what he'd known all along, that the wilderness isn't an enemy. It's a mirror. In the end, his story is less about wolves or survival, and more about simplicity, the kind of life that strips away everything unnecessary until only truth remains. Just you. The dogs, the snow, the wind. Everything else, money, fame, noise, melts away like frost on a warm morning. Epilogue. The fire burns low, so let's end where it began, in the small glow of a stove somewhere in the Alaskan night. The wind outside howls faintly through spruce branches. The dogs stir, stretch, then settle again. The man in the chair, Frank Glaser, closes his notebook, sets it on the table, and leans back. His face catches the orange light. His eyes are calm. Outside, the world keeps changing. Inside, the silence stays the same. Because long after his footsteps faded from the snow, his story still teaches the same quiet truth, that sometimes the most extraordinary life is the one lived entirely on your own terms. Quietly, patiently, and without needing anyone to notice. Hey again. Still here? Good. You've made it through storms, wolves, and 40 years of frozen beans. Let's stay a little longer. Not to talk about what Frank did, but what it all meant. Because once the snow settles, once the dogs stop pacing, once the man is gone, the wilderness doesn't really care. It keeps going. And yet in that endless white, something of Frank Glaser still hums. Quiet, small but persistent. He's become less of a person now, more of an echo. The kind of figure you remember when you stare at a frozen horizon and wonder what kind of life could ever fit out there. Life without audience, Frank's story is strange to modern ears because it has no clear purpose. He didn't go north to strike gold or write a book or find himself. He just went and stayed. It's unsettling in a way. We're used to stories where people conquer something, learn something, or at least come home to applause. Frank did none of that. He just lived quietly, did his work, and disappeared into the snow again. It's the ultimate anti-drama. A man so detached from spectacle that even nature in all her deadly glory couldn't rattle him. When wolves howled at night, he didn't shiver or romanticize it. He'd just say, "They're talking business." And maybe that's why his story lingers, because it's the opposite of how most of us live. We chase noise. He chased quiet. We seek comfort. He sought clarity. Solitude reconsidered. People talk about loneliness as if it's a disease. Frank treated it like weather, something to dress for. He never described himself as lonely. He said he liked company that doesn't talk much, which honestly is as close to enlightenment as it gets. Out there, solitude wasn't empty. It was full. Full of snowstorms, paw prints, shifting light, and all the little sounds civilization hides from us. The crack of ice, The whisper of wind through spruce needles, the rhythmic huff of sled dogs breathing in unison. He didn't have to meditate to clear his mind. His entire life was one long, slow exhale. And maybe that's the secret to his endurance. Not toughness, not survival skills, just acceptance. When the weather turned, he turned with it. When the rivers froze, he waited. When the wolves sang, he listened. It's a rhythm most of us lost somewhere between notifications and traffic lights, the cult of the wilderness. We like to romanticize people like Frank, turn them into rugged heroes or wilderness prophets. But he wasn't either. He was just competent. Competence isn't glamorous, but it's steady. It's knowing how to light a fire when your fingers don't bend anymore. It's patching a sled runner with baling wire instead of waiting for new parts to arrive. It's never complaining, because out there complaining wastes heat. Frank didn't need transcendence or mysticism to appreciate the wild. He saw the world exactly as it was, indifferent, magnificent, and occasionally inconvenient. He didn't talk about nature as a mother or a goddess. He called it country. The country's good, he'd say. It just doesn't care if you're in it. And that's not cruelty, that's truth. The wilderness wasn't trying to kill him any more than the sun tries to burn. It just is. Frank understood that, and in doing so he found a kind of peace most of us only stumble across in poems or guided meditations. Time, in the slow lane out there, time loses its edges. There are no weekdays, no deadlines, just the slow cycle of freeze and thaw. Frank lived by seasons, not schedules. Spring meant swollen rivers and migrating caribou. Summer meant mosquitoes the size of thumbtacks. Autumn was trapping prep. Winter was endurance, each year the same, but never boring. He found comfort in repetition, in the quiet predictability of hard work. When asked once if he ever got tired of the routine, he said, "No, the country changes just enough to keep up." That's the kind of sentence that sounds simple until you realize it's profound. Because really the world doesn't repeat itself. We just stop paying attention. Frank never stopped paying attention. He noticed the small differences. The way snow settled on certain slopes, how ice shifted color before breaking, how a wolf's paw print looked softer when it was hunting than when it was traveling. Tiny details. The kind that only appear to people who've slowed down enough to see them. The art of doing nothing dramatic. You might expect a man like Frank to have some great cinematic moment, a last stand against a bear, a near-death epiphany, something fit for Hollywood. But no, his heroism was the unglamorous kind, the sort that comes from doing ordinary things well every single day under extraordinary conditions. He wasn't out there proving anything. He just liked being where he didn't have to explain himself. There's a lesson in that, maybe even a gentle warning. Because in a world obsessed with achievement, Frank reminds us that contentment is sometimes the greater act of defiance. He once told a friend, "Folks get restless when they don't need to be, and that's it." The human condition, summarized by a man whose hobbies included skinning foxes at 40 below. Memory in the snow. There's something almost cruel about how wilderness erases memory. A cabin collapses, a trail grows over, bones sink under moss, and yet Frank's traces remain, faint but stubborn. Somewhere out there, one of his trap cabins still stands. Someone found an old tin cup, initials scratched in faintly FG. You can almost see it. The man stepping out one winter morning, tightening his parka, calling softly to his dogs. Then gone into the white, no farewell, no legacy plan. Just the simple confidence that his absence would blend perfectly with the silence he'd lived in all along. Civilization and its discontents every once in a while, Frank would visit town. And every time he seemed slightly confused by how loud people were. He once said, after hearing a car horn for the first time in months, "If a man needs to shout that loud, Maybe he shouldn't be driving. He didn't dislike people. He just didn't understand why they complicated everything. He watched men build machines to move faster, then complain about not having time. He watched people chase money to buy comfort, then complain of boredom. Out in the bush, boredom didn't exist. You were always too busy not dying. Frank's simplicity wasn't about poverty or retreat. It was about proportion, knowing how much is enough. He had a rifle, an axe, a sled, and a stove. He never wanted more. And really, what else do you need when the stars themselves are your ceiling? The universe in Fur and Frost Frank might never have used the word philosophy, but he lived one. Every choice he made echoed a quiet belief that the smallest things matter most. The feel of a dog's fur against your glove, the sound of a single snowflake landing on still air, the way moonlight turns wolf tracks silver. These weren't poetic to him. They were simply facts, the vocabulary of a world he knew by heart. If you asked him about spirituality, he probably would have chuckled and said, "Haven't met a preacher yet who can outlast a blizzard," which, in a way, is its own gospel, the gospel of endurance, patience, and unsentimental awe. The myth becomes the mirror today. We talk about Frank like a legend, the wolfman, the last trapper, the ghost of the Alaska Range. But if he could hear all that, he'd probably roll his eyes. He wasn't chasing mythology. He was just doing the work. And yet maybe that's exactly what makes him mythic, the sheer absence of performance, because deep down, every person who hears his story recognizes something familiar, that quiet yearning to step off the map, to stop explaining yourself, to breathe air that hasn't been measured, monetized, or uploaded. We won't all live in cabins. We won't all trap wolves or survive 50 winters. But maybe in our own small ways, we can still borrow his rhythm, that calm, practical grace of simply existing without noise, lessons from the quiet man. If Frank could give advice, and he wouldn't, because unsolicited advice wastes breath, it would probably sound something like this. Keep your gear in order. Fix what you break. Don't talk unless you have to. The weather's going to win, so don't argue with it. And when wolves howl, listen. They might be saying something useful. It's not self-help. It's just reality, stripped of polish. And in that stripped-down reality lies the gentlest form of wisdom, that life doesn't need to be optimized, only lived. The snow keeps falling somewhere right now. In Alaska, a snowstorm is swallowing the horizon. The wind howls through spruce trees. The rivers are locked under ice. And maybe, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the echo of dogs running over the drifts. Faint, rhythmic, eternal. That's the sound of a life fully lived. Not spectacular, not tragic, just steady. The kind of life that leaves behind no empire, no invention, no empire, but something far rarer. Peace. Closing the lamp so if you're listening in the dark right now. Eyes heavy, blankets warm. Take a slow breath and imagine that cabin again. A single flame dances on a stove. The dogs sigh in their sleep. Snow presses against the walls, muting every sound. Frank sits by the window, watching the aurora shimmer faintly across the horizon. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't need to, because everything that ever needed to be said about wilderness, solitude, and survival is already written out there in the snow. And like Frank, you don't have to understand it. You just have to listen. Fade to quiet. The story of the Wolfman isn't really about Alaska. It's about stillness, the kind that waits patiently for you to notice it. It's about learning that solitude doesn't mean being alone. It means being complete. So let the snow keep falling. Let the world keep spinning. And somewhere in the soft rhythm between breath and silence, that's where Frank Glaser still walks, quietly, endlessly, at peace with the wild he never tried to tame. The snow keeps falling. It always does. Somewhere in Alaska, a river bends through a valley that no one names anymore. The spruce trees lean toward each other, whispering in a language of ice. Somewhere beneath that white silence, there might still be a pair of iron trap springs, rusting away under moss and time. Frank Glaser's name isn't carved on any mountain, but the country remembers him the only way wilderness ever remembers anything, through absence. The quiet that outlasts. When Frank died, there wasn't a ceremony in the woods. No rifles fired, no flags folded. He simply wasn't there anymore. But the wilderness, stubborn and unbothered, didn't stop to notice. The rivers kept breaking. The wolves kept hunting. The northern lights kept sweeping their slow green fire across the horizon. That's the strange mercy of wild places. They don't mourn. They absorb. And maybe that's the kindest thing a landscape can do for a man who gave it everything. Let him dissolve into it. The man who didn't vanish. Sometimes, park rangers still find his old roots. A log cut too neatly to be natural. A hand-forged nail in a rotted post. A boot heel frozen in old mud. It's as if the country occasionally exhales one of his memories, not to be seen, just to prove that it remembers how. In the quiet hours of late winter, when wind presses through the spruce and the stars burn like frost, some trappers swear they can hear sled runners creaking over distant ice. They call it the old man's road. No one's ever found its end. The philosophy of disappearing Frank's real genius wasn't survival. It was erasure. He lived so lightly that the world barely noticed when he left it. He didn't burden the land with waste or monuments. He didn't build anything that couldn't rot back into the ground. He treated his existence like a guest, brief, respectful, quiet. And maybe that's the purest kind of immortality, to live in a way that leaves no scar, only a story that drifts between campfires and snowstorms. Echoes in modern ears today. People scroll through videos of off-grid living, of log cabins and crackling fires, of men building chairs from trees. They call it the simple life. But for Frank, simplicity wasn't an aesthetic. It was arithmetic. If you had one axe, you didn't need two. If the dogs could sleep outside, you didn't build a barn. If you had enough beans to last the month, that was wealth. He wouldn't have understood hashtags or sponsorships or content. He might have said, if you're busy filming yourself, you're not watching the weather. That's not cynicism. It's proportion. And proportion is what modern life keeps losing track of. The lessons he never taught, no one asked Frank to lecture. He didn't write a book or record a diary. Yet from what little survives, we can gather a quiet creed. Attention is love. To notice is to care. Silence is strength. Words don't warm you. Fire does. Work is peace. Every task done honestly is its own reward. The land is not yours. You're only visiting. They're small lessons, but the older the world gets, the truer they sound. Ghost stories for the practical mind. If you ever camp alone in Alaska, you'll hear stories about him. They're never told the same way twice. Some say his dogs still roam the ridgeline, running without harnesses, their paws never leaving prints. Some say his cabin lights up on the coldest nights, though there's no chimney smoke. Others say the wolves still pause by a certain clearing, ears forward, as if waiting for someone who used to talk to them without fear. Maybe those stories are true. Maybe they're just the wilderness, remembering the shape of a man who once fit perfectly into it. Civilization's memory in the small museum at Fairbanks. Behind a glass case, there's a faded photograph of Frank Glaser, a lean man in a fur-lined coat, eyes half smiling, dogs restless beside him. Most visitors walk past it without much thought. But once in a while someone stops, stares and whispers, "He looks like he knows something." And he does. Something so simple it's nearly impossible to say aloud. That life isn't something to win. It's something to endure gracefully. The stillness between stars imagined for a moment the last night he ever saw the aurora. The dogs are asleep, curled in the snow. The stove ticks softly as the fire dies. Outside, the sky ripples in pale green silence. He sits by the window, hands folded, eyes half closed. There's no music, no thought of legacy, no drama, just the endless hum of cold air and the quiet satisfaction of a man who finally has nothing left to do. That's not loneliness. That's arrival. The world moves on. Planes now fly over places where Frank once walked for days. GPS marks routes he navigated by memory. Tourists take pictures where he once waited out storms. And that's fine. He wouldn't have minded. He never mistook solitude for ownership. Maybe, if he could see the world now, the noise, the endless talk, the flashing screens, he'd shrug and say, "You can't hear the wind with all that racket." Then he'd step back into the snow and vanish again, leaving only the faint hiss of sled runners fading into the dark. What the wolves remember, wolves have long memories, not of individuals but of patterns, the sound of a certain whistle, the smell of a certain campfire. If you believe the old trappers, the packs still circle certain valleys more cautiously than others. They pause, sniff the air, and move on quietly, as if respecting an old agreement. That's the truest memorial Frank could have hoped for. Not a statue, not a headline, but a moment of silence from the wild itself. The map without roads. If you could draw Frank's life on a map, it wouldn't be a line. It would be a series of loops, seasonal, circular, humble. Back and forth between rivers and ridges, between work and rest, between solitude and stillness. It's the opposite of progress, and that's the point. He didn't go anywhere because he was already there. That's the hidden wisdom of the wilderness. When you stop trying to arrive, you finally do die 12. The human in the snow. We like to think the wilderness is inhuman. But maybe it's more human than we are now. The trees bend and recover. The animals adapt. Even the cold finds ways to be beautiful. Frank understood that humanity isn't about comfort. It's about awareness. The ability to look at a frozen river and feel both fear and wonder in the same breath. To accept that you are fragile, but to live anyway. That's what it means to survive 40 years alone. Not to dominate nature, but to keep falling in love with it, day after brutal day. The gentle exit toward the end, Frank came back to town more often. He'd sit in cafes, quiet as ever, watching people hurry through the warmth. Someone once asked if he missed the bush. He smiled and said, "It's all bush if you don't talk too much." Then he finished his coffee, pulled on his gloves, and walked out into the snow one last time. No one knows exactly where he went. And maybe that's exactly how he wanted it. The sound of nothing happening, if you listen carefully, to the wind, to the static between thoughts, you might catch it, that deep, patient rhythm of a world that doesn't need us, but allows us anyway. That's the sound Frank listened to for 40 years. The same sound you hear when everything else has stopped demanding your attention. It's not silence. It's the voice of the world before words. Drift off gently. So now, as your eyes grow heavy, imagine this. The cabin is dark. The storm has passed. The dogs are gone. The traps are gone. But the snow still falls soft as breath. Somewhere beyond the spruce line, a single figure moves slowly across the horizon, steady, unhurried, at peace. No audience, no noise. Just the long, forgiving quiet of the North. That's Frank Glaser's legacy. Not a tale of survival, but a lullaby about stillness. A reminder that the wild isn't out there. It's inside you, waiting for everything else to quiet down. And when you finally drift into sleep tonight, let the snow take you too. Not to freeze, but to rest, to forget the noise, to remember the rhythm, to walk beside the wolfman and to breathe slowly, in time with the wind. The world has a short memory for noise, but a long memory for quiet. When the last snow fell over Frank's trails, it covered everything, and his traps, his footprints, his campfire ashes. But stories, unlike snow, don't melt. They just drift, changing shape with every new voice that tells them. The wilderness doesn't need witnesses. For most people, living 40 years in the wilderness seems like a form of punishment. For Frank, it was punctuation, the necessary pause between the chaos of civilization and the simplicity of survival. He never asked to be famous. He never asked to be found. But in the decades since his death, people have gone looking anyway, for his old cabins, for his tools, even for clues about how someone could live that long without going mad. The answer is frustratingly simple. He didn't try to find himself. He just didn't lose himself to noise. That's the part most of us get backwards. The people who follow his trail. Every few years, some writer or documentarian decides to follow Frank's path. They come with cameras, waterproof boots, satellite phones, and a sense of adventure that fades the first time a mosquito lands on their nose. Most of them don't make it a week, few last a month. And every single one comes back with the same expression, a mix of humility and disbelief. They all say the same thing. I thought it would be peaceful. It was just loud, because the wilderness isn't silent. It hums, clicks, howls, breathes, and if you can't quiet your own mind, you'll never hear what it's trying to tell you. That's the lesson Frank mastered, not to escape noise, but to stop contributing to it. The mythification of the man over time. People started calling him the Wolfman, a name that sounds mysterious, maybe even dangerous, but the truth was much gentler. He didn't live with wolves like some legend of the forest. He just respected them. He understood that in the north the wolves weren't villains. They were neighbors. He once said, they take what they need. So do I. And that was the closest he ever came to philosophy. But give humanity a few decades and they'll take your quiet truth and turn it into a folk tale. Now the Wolfman walks in campfire stories, sometimes as a ghost, sometimes as a guide. People say he appears to lost hikers, leading them back to safety. They say his shadow follows sled dogs when storms roll in. That's how myths are born. Out of our need to imagine someone still watching over the places we've forgotten how to love. The wilderness as inheritance in. The years since Frank's time, Alaska has changed. There are highways now, radio towers, and internet connections that hum even in tiny towns. But step just a few miles off the road, and the land swallows all that up again. It's still a place that doesn't care who you are. Still too vast to conquer, too patient to impress. And maybe that's why stories like Frank's still matter, because they remind people that wilderness isn't a vacation spot. It's a mirror. Whatever you bring into it, fear, ego, peace, it reflects right back at you, amplified by snow and silence. Frank walked into that mirror and stayed there. Most of us just visit, take a photo and run away before it shows us something uncomfortable. The scientists and the solitude after his death, a few researchers tried to understand how someone could stay mentally stable in isolation for that long. They studied old notes from trappers and naturalists, trying to piece together the psychological puzzle. Their conclusion was boring but honest. Frank wasn't lonely because he didn't expect company. Loneliness only hurts when you think you deserve not to be alone. Frank just accepted it as weather. Sometimes calm, sometimes brutal, always temporary. That's another thing modern life forgets. Solitude isn't the enemy of sanity. It's the test of it. 6. The Wolfman's philosophy, retold people like to romanticize him. The rugged mountain man, the hermit philosopher, the ultimate survivor. But if you'd asked Frank, he'd probably say something like, "I just didn't like town, that's it." No poetic motives, no rebellion against society. Just a man who preferred trees over traffic. And yet within that simplicity lies something profound. We spend billions chasing peace, through therapy, retreats, apps, and vacations, when peace was always free and freezing, sitting right there under the northern lights. Frank didn't invent a philosophy. He lived one by accident. The townsfolk remember in Fairbanks the old-timers still talk about him. A few remember him visiting in the 1950s. Tall, thin, quiet, with a beard that looked more like a weather pattern than facial hair. He'd come in for supplies, maybe talk about wolf behavior, if you asked the right question. He had a dry wit that slipped out when people least expected it. One clerk once joked that he smelled like he hadn't bathed since spring. Frank replied, "That's because I didn't." And then he smiled slowly, like he'd just told the best joke in Alaska. He wasn't unfriendly, just edited. He spoke the way he lived, using only what was necessary. The wilderness as memory. There's a strange thing about memory. It fades for humans, but not for places. You can walk through a forest that burned 70 years ago, and the soil still remembers. The moss still grows softer where someone once slept. The animals still travel the same invisible highways carved by footsteps generations ago. So maybe Frank isn't gone at all. Maybe he's just diffused into the rivers, the winds, the way snow gathers on the same ridge every year. If you listen carefully enough, you might catch a sound that isn't the wind. A sigh, a shuffle, a whisper of fur. Or maybe just your imagination doing what imagination does best, refusing to let silence stay empty. The digital afterlife, it's funny. The man who never wanted attention now has thousands of search results online. Documentaries, articles, podcasts, even short TikToks about Alaska's wolfman. If he could see it, he'd probably laugh. Or maybe just shake his head and go cut more firewood. That's the paradox of our time. We can't let people vanish anymore. Every face, every story, every moment ends up archived somewhere in the infinite scroll. We turn solitude into spectacle and call it inspiration. Frank's life wasn't an aesthetic. It was a quiet refusal to participate in noise. And that refusal is what draws us to him now, because deep down we're all exhausted by the sound of our own voices. What the wolves, no wolves, still live where Frank once trapped. Their packs rise and fall with the years, their trails shifting like tides, but their rhythm hasn't changed. If wolves remember anything of Frank, it isn't his face. It's his respect. The way he didn't interfere without purpose. The way he hunted only what he needed. The way he treated the pack not as rivals, but as fellow creatures in the same cold economy of survival. Maybe that's why they never attacked him. Predators recognize calm. They don't understand kindness, but they understand boundaries. Frank lived entirely within that understanding. No moralizing, no fear. Just balance. It's not mystical. It's just the kind of intelligence we've largely forgotten how to practice. Modern loneliness versus ancient silence today, you can sit in a city of millions and still feel isolated. Frank sat in a forest for decades and never once claimed loneliness. The difference is noise. We measure connection by sound. Voices, messages, notifications. Frank measured it by rhythm. The breathing of his dogs, the cracking of ice, the steady pulse of life continuing around him. He was never truly alone because he never expected the world to revolve around him. He was part of it, not apart from it. And that small distinction might be the only thing standing between peace and despair. Lessons that survived him. What's left then, after all the snow, all the silence, all the time? Maybe just a few quiet truths. The world doesn't owe you comfort. It offers you existence. That's enough. Solitude is not punishment, it's permission. The measure of a life isn't noise, but stillness. You don't have to be remembered to have mattered. Frank lived all of that without ever putting it into words. And maybe that's why it still resonates. Because some truths are too steady to shout. The northern lights keep moving. Every winter, when the sky turns green and bends like a ribbon, someone in Alaska looks up and thinks of him. Not because they knew him, but because they recognize the feeling he must have had. That quiet awe of being small and alive in something endless. The aurora keeps sweeping, the same way it did over his cabin roof. Maybe he's still watching it, just without the burden of breath. If the afterlife exists for someone like Frank, it probably looks a lot like Alaska, cold, silent, and endless, with a faint blue fire rippling across the horizon. When the story ends, every story has to end somewhere. Even the slow ones, even the sleepy ones. But some lives don't end, they just thin out like mist. They stop being stories and start being landscapes. You can't quote them. You can only walk through them. Frank Glaser's life was like that. A mapless journey that ended right where it began, surrounded by snow, under a sky that didn't care who he was and wouldn't need to. He came from nowhere, lived for nothing in particular, and in doing so, managed to embody everything we keep forgetting to value. Simplicity, endurance, quiet. Drift. One last time, so let's drift one last time with him. Into the soft dark, the endless snow, the deep hum of northern air. The dogs are gone. The fire's out. The wolves are distant but near enough to hear. The wind moves across the valley, reshaping everything it touches. Even names, even stories. And somewhere beyond the reach of maps, the wolfman walks again. Not a ghost, not a legend, just another heartbeat in the frozen rhythm of the wild. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still here, congratulations. You've officially outlasted most people's attention spans, and you're basically living in the same mindset as Frank Glaser. Quiet, stubborn, and a little too comfortable with loneliness. Tonight we're drifting into the final chapter of Alaska's Wolfman. His last winters, his final reflections, and the strange way his story just fades into snow. So settle in again. Dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's wander back into the frozen wild. By the late 1950s, Frank Glaser was no longer the fearless young trapper chasing wolf packs across the tundra. He was in his 70s now, his hair gone white, his hands a little shaky, his joints stiff from decades of frostbite and hard labor. He'd outlived nearly everyone he'd ever known. Most of his old companions, fellow trappers, rangers, bush pilots, were long gone. Some had moved south for retirement. Others had simply disappeared into the wilderness and never came back. Glaser, however, stayed, because where could he go? Civilization had never suited him, and he wasn't about to start pretending otherwise now. He spent much of his later years in Fairbanks, Alaska, still working part-time for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The agency occasionally called him for advice, like a human encyclopedia of wolf behavior. He didn't need textbooks or theories. He had first-hand experience, the kind you only get after spending thousands of nights listening to howls under the northern lights. Sometimes, younger biologists would visit him for interviews, armed with notebooks and tape recorders. They'd ask, "Mr. Glaser, what's the best way to track a wolf?" He'd smile, that dry, lopsided grin, and say something like, "Well, don't overthink it. Just think like one." Then he'd lean back, sip his coffee, and share a story that sounded half folklore, half field report. By then, Alaska had changed beyond recognition. Roads were carved through places he once reached only by sled. Airplanes buzzed over valleys where he'd once heard only the wind. The frontier was shrinking fast, and Glaser was one of its last true relics. He used to tell people, You can't get lost in Alaska anymore. There's too many maps. It wasn't bitterness, just quiet disappointment. For him, wildness wasn't just about animals or land. It was about freedom. The right to vanish, to live unseen, to be forgotten if you wanted to. And that world was ending. Let's drift back for a second, though, to one of his final field trips. In the early 1960s, when he was already pushing 80, Glaser took a solo trip north toward the Brooks Range. Why? Because apparently, after 6 decades of wilderness living, he still hadn't had enough. He wanted to see if the wolves there had changed, if modernization, airplanes, and human encroachment had made them different. Spoiler, they hadn't. He found them just as they'd always been, cautious, smart, and unbothered by his presence. He spent days camped out, tracking a small pack that moved between river valleys. At night, he sat by his little fire wrapped in an old wool blanket, listening to the same music he'd heard for 40 years, the wolves singing in the cold dark. He once told a friend that hearing wolves howling wasn't frightening. It was comforting. It's when you don't hear them, he said, that something feels wrong. Imagine that. Most people hear wolves and think danger. He heard them and thought home. When he returned to Fairbanks after that trip, he was noticeably slower. Age was catching up, even to a man who'd once been nearly indestructible. His eyesight faded. His memory started slipping. But the wilderness was still sharp in his mind. He'd sometimes sit for hours just describing the shape of a mountain, ridge, or the way snow drifted in a particular valley. Like he could still see it in front of him. He wasn't poetic about it, though. He didn't talk about the beauty of nature or man's place in the world. He talked like a mechanic explaining an engine. Practical, observant, and just a bit sarcastic. A friend once asked him if he ever got lonely out there. He just said, sure, but people aren't that good for company either. In his final years, Frank Glaser became something of a local legend in Fairbanks. People called him the Wolfman of Alaska, part nickname, part myth. He didn't love the attention, but he didn't fight it either. When local kids came by to ask about wolves, he'd talk to them, slow and measured. He'd describe how wolves could tell from miles away if a caribou was sick, or how they'd test the ice before crossing. The way he talked made it sound like he wasn't describing animals, but neighbors. He said wolves were smarter than most people gave them credit for. They were cautious, family-oriented, and surprisingly fair. They'll share food with pups, he'd say. Not many people would do that, and then, of course, he'd smirk. By 1970, Glaser was in his mid-80s. He rarely ventured into the wilderness anymore, but he still lived simply. A small cabin, a few dogs, some old traps hanging on the wall. There's something beautifully symmetrical about how his story ends. No great tragedy, no headline, no frozen expedition or heroic last stand. He just faded out quietly, much like the wolves he'd watched all his life. He passed away in Fairbanks in 1975. He was 86 years old. No fanfare, no national obituary, just a few local mentions, mostly written by people who had known him or heard his stories secondhand. One of them called him the last of the true Alaskan woodsmen, and that feels right. After his death, a few researchers compiled his interviews and notes. Some were archived at the University of Alaska. Others were passed around in photocopies, shared by wildlife enthusiasts who admired his life's work. One of those notes simply read, "You don't conquer nature. You get along with it or it kills you. It's the most straightforward philosophy he ever wrote, and possibly the truest. Let's float one last time over that frozen landscape, the endless white plains, the low sun glowing on snow, the faint tracks of wolves weaving through the distance. Somewhere out there you can almost imagine Glaser sitting by his little fire, boots steaming, rifle across his knees, listening to the wind and thinking about nothing in particular. He wasn't famous. He didn't get rich. He didn't even really leave anything behind, except a reminder that a person can live quietly, stubbornly, and contentedly on their own terms, and that maybe, just maybe, that's worth more than glory. So, as we close this long, quiet story, remember, the Wolfman of Alaska wasn't just surviving out there. He was living exactly the way he wanted for over 40 years. Thanks for staying with me through this one. Get comfortable, close your eyes if you haven't already, and drift off imagining the sound of wolves howling somewhere far, far north. Hey again, friend. If you're still awake and somehow, you've made it to the end of a story that doesn't really end, because people like Frank Glaser, they don't just vanish. They sort of linger, like campfire smoke that never quite clears, or a wolf track half buried in fresh snow. So, let's just drift together for this last stretch. No rush, no noise, just the afterglow of one man's quiet life, echoing through the wilderness he called home. After Glaser died in 1975, Alaska didn't really stop to notice. There were no documentaries, no statues, no fancy memorials. He wasn't the kind of man people built museums for. But for those who knew him, the pilots, the trappers, the old park rangers, his name came up often. Usually late at night, over coffee in some roadside diner, when conversation slowed and the wind moaned outside. They'd say things like, "Remember Glaser? The Wolfman?" He could track a wolf through a blizzard. He used to outthink 'em, you know, like he was one of them. And then someone would always add, half joking, half serious, maybe he still is. Because even in death, the legend stuck. A few years later, wildlife biologists began rediscovering his old reports. Those notes he'd written by kerosene light, tucked between maps and dog-eared field journals. Most were brief, almost cryptic. One of them said, "Wolf packs differ like people. Some smart, some lazy, some mean," another read. "They don't kill for fun. That's people's job." Dry, sharp, honest, classic Glaser. It's funny, decades of formal research into wolf behavior have largely confirmed what he already knew by intuition alone. The man didn't have a college degree. He didn't need one. He had 40 winters and a brain wired for observation. When scientists now talk about wolves as social, intelligent, emotionally complex animals, well, Glaser was nodding along somewhere in 1940. He just didn't bother publishing it in Science Journal. He was too busy thawing his coffee on a campfire. Today, there's still no monument to him, but there are traces and quiet ones. If you drive north from Fairbanks toward the Yukon River, you'll find a stretch of land locals sometimes call Glaser country. It's not official. It's just a nickname passed between old trappers and hunters, a tip of the hat to the man who roamed there longer than anyone. The landscape itself hasn't changed much. The black spruce still rise out of the permafrost. The rivers still twist like silver veins across white plains. The silence is still so heavy, you can almost hear your thoughts bounce back. And every now and then, someone swears they see wolf tracks crossing an old trail near there. Deep, clean, purposeful, as if a pack had just passed through. Maybe they have. Or maybe, as the locals like to say, Glaser's still out checking traps. There's a certain poetry in how the man and the myth have fused together. He didn't want to be remembered as a hero. He wasn't one. He didn't fight a war, cure a disease, or invent anything, but he did live honestly. In a world that rarely rewards honesty, he didn't fake toughness. He didn't romanticize nature. He just adapted to it. That's probably why the wolves tolerated him. They recognized one of their own. Quiet, observant, unsentimental. There's this story, yet probably exaggerated, like most campfire tales, that once, in his later years, Glaser left food out for a lone wolf that hung near his cabin. He never tried to tame it, Never gave it a name. Never claimed it was his friend, he just said it was hungry. I had extra, that's it. No moral, no deeper meaning. Just two old predators sharing space, each understanding the other's silence. If you visit the Alaska Museum of the North in Fairbanks today, you'll find a few photos of him tucked away in the archives. One shows him standing beside a small bush plane, bundled in heavy furs, squinting at the camera like he's mildly annoyed by it. Another shows him kneeling beside a wolf carcass, part of his early work for the Wildlife Service. It's not a trophy photo. There's no grin, no pride. Just a man doing a job, his face unreadable. Looking at it now feels almost eerie. You can sense how little he cared about legacy, about fame. He wasn't performing. He was existing. And in a world where everyone wants to be seen, that might be the rarest trait of all. Let's pause for a second, though. Imagine this. A modern traveler, maybe a young biologist, hiking alone near the Yukon Flats. The snow is falling softly. The light is fading. Their breath comes out in small clouds. They find a small clearing, maybe a place where someone once camped. There's nothing left but a few rusted metal scraps. Maybe an old trap, half buried under moss. They stop and look around, realizing they're standing in the footprints, literal or not, of the Wolfman of Alaska. The air feels heavy. Not spooky, just old, and somewhere far off a wolf howls. The traveler smiles without knowing why. The funny thing is, Glaser's life sounds impossible to most people now. 40 years alone in the wilderness. No electricity, no phone, no grocery stores. But back then, in Alaska's early days, it wasn't so rare. What was rare was surviving it that long, thriving in it, staying sane. He did all three, somehow. He managed to carve a life out of cold and silence without becoming bitter. He didn't go mad. He didn't lose his humanity. If anything, he became more human, stripped down to the essentials. He once said, "The secret is simple, don't fight the cold. Don't fight the hunger. Don't fight the loneliness. Just let them sit with you." That sounds almost Buddhist, or maybe just the wisdom of someone who stopped expecting life to be comfortable. After his death, writers occasionally mentioned him in passing. A few nature magazines ran small features, "The Wolfman of Alaska," "The Last of the Lone Trappers," things like that. But mostly he became folklore. A name muttered in bars, in ranger cabins, in winter stories told to tourists who think Alaska is still a wild frontier. He's become something like a ghost, not a haunting one, but a guardian spirit of sorts. A symbol of endurance. The idea that one person can live honestly with nature and not need to dominate it. If you ever read online forums for Alaskan bush pilots or old-timers, you'll still find his name pop up. People share half-remembered stories, photos, maybe a line or two from his old interviews. They talk about how the modern world has lost that kind of grit, that kind of quiet independence, and maybe they're right. So what's left of Frank Glaser now? A handful of notes, a few faded photographs, and a legend. One that keeps being retold, reshaped, softened with every retelling. That's not a bad way to go, really, because maybe immortality doesn't come from fame or books or monuments. Maybe it comes from stories told in low voices around a campfire. From tracks in the snow that fade but never disappear completely. So as we close this out, let's end the same way he might have liked it, quietly. Picture it, a small log cabin under the pale Alaskan moon. The fire's burned down to embers. Outside, the snow falls soundlessly. Somewhere in the distance, a single wolf howls, long, low, and lonely. And in that silence, you can almost hear a voice, calm, steady, faintly amused, saying, "You don't conquer the wild. You just learn how to listen." That's the voice of the Wolfman, and maybe if you're very still, you'll hear it too. Good night, traveler, and sleep well, out there somewhere under the same stars that once watched over Frank Glaser. Hey there, You made it. All the way to the end of a story that took us through 40 years of snow, silence, and stubborn survival. This last part isn't really about facts or dates. It's about meaning, or maybe the lack of it, which is somehow the most comforting thing of all. So lie back, get comfortable. Let the world go a little blurry at the edges. We're just going to drift for a while and think about what it all really says. This life of Alaska's wolfman, Frank Glaser. We live in a world that hates silence. Every empty moment has to be filled, with noise, with notifications, with something. Frank Glaser lived in a world that didn't offer that choice. When he sat alone in a cabin miles from anyone, there was no hum of electricity, no buzz of a phone, no glow of a screen. Just the wind, the crackle of fire, the sound of his own breathing. For most people, that kind of quiet would be unbearable. But for him, it was normal, natural. He wasn't meditating or finding himself. He wasn't performing solitude for self-improvement. He was just living, the same way a wolf lives in the woods, efficient, a little scruffy, entirely at peace with being ignored. The thing about Glaser's story is that it's not heroic. It's not inspiring in the way we usually use that word. It doesn't make you want to quit your job and live off-grid. If anything, it makes you realize how incredibly hard that would be. How cold, how lonely, how heavy the quiet could get, but somewhere underneath that harshness is something real, a kind of calm honesty that feels rare now. He wasn't trying to escape society. He wasn't rebelling against anything. He just didn't fit, and instead of forcing it, he walked away. That's it. That's the whole philosophy. Sometimes we treat isolation like a failure, like being alone is something to fix. But for Glaser, being alone wasn't punishment. It was clarity. He had work to do, wolves to track, snares to check. His life was small, simple, repetitive, but full of attention. He noticed things most people never would. How the snow changes color just before dawn. How a wolf's tracks curve subtly when it's listening for danger. How silence can tell you as much as noise. That kind of noticing takes time. It takes boredom. It takes patience. It's the opposite of modern life. Maybe that's why his story feels almost alien now. Like it's from another planet, you know. People like to say they don't make them like that anymore. And maybe they don't, but the truth is, the world doesn't allow people like that anymore. We've closed the gaps where mystery used to live. The wild places are mapped, the edges are fenced, and the silence is always interrupted by something man-made. Glaser's Alaska barely exists now, at least not the way he knew it. But the idea of it, the idea of living quietly, honestly, without needing to be seen, still has weight. It's like a ghost that lingers, whispering, "You don't need to be everywhere. You don't need to be known. You just need to be okay where you are." And maybe that's the heart of it. If you strip away the snow, the wolves, the furs, the rifles, what's left? Just a man. A man who found meaning not in words or philosophy, but in living the same day over and over, until it became sacred through repetition. Wake up, light a fire, feed the dogs, step outside into the cold, track, watch, listen, eat, sleep, repeat. That's not a failure of imagination. That's devotion, the quiet kind. He didn't call it mindfulness. He didn't write a book about it. He just did it every day for 40 years. Maybe that's why he was so comfortable with wolves. They lived like that too. No ambition, no anxiety about the future. Just to focus on the moment, on survival, family, routine. People think wolves are symbols of freedom, but they're not. They're creatures of order. They follow paths. They stick to rules. They have boundaries, and so did Glaser. He wasn't free in the chaotic sense. He was free in the disciplined sense, the way a monk or a craftsman is free. He didn't fight the wilderness. He became part of it. It's strange to think about how someone can be both forgotten and eternal at the same time. His name isn't in history textbooks. You won't find him in a national park brochure. But if you talk to old Alaskans, or read the footnotes of obscure wildlife studies, he's there. A shadow at the edge of the frame, that's fitting, isn't it? The Wolfman, half human, half legend, still pacing through the collective memory like a ghost made of snow and silence. He wouldn't want more than that. He didn't want fame. He didn't want attention. He just wanted to live his way on his terms, and he did. So here's the quiet truth. The wilderness didn't need Frank Glaser, but it accepted him, which, if you know anything about wilderness, is a far greater honor. The wolves didn't love him. They didn't hate him either. They just tolerated him. They saw him as part of the landscape. Another creature surviving the cold. That's what balance looks like. Not domination. Not harmony, just coexistence. We talk a lot about conquering nature, but maybe that's the wrong goal. Maybe the point isn't to conquer it, or even to understand it, but simply to live alongside it without ruining it. That's what Glaser did, for 40 years. And then, when it was time, he left quietly, like a wolf slipping back into the trees. So if there's a moral here, though he'd probably roll his eyes at the idea of one, it's this. You don't have to make noise to make meaning. You don't have to be known to have mattered. And you don't have to escape the world to find peace. You just have to listen more than you speak. Glaser listened unto the snow, to the wolves, to his own silence, and in doing so, he heard the world in a way most of us never will. And maybe that's a good place to end. The fire's gone out now. The stars are still. The wolves have stopped howling. Somewhere far north, the land he walked is sleeping, frozen, endless, and untouched. If you stand there long enough, you might almost hear footsteps crunching softly through the snow. Or maybe it's just the wind. Either way, it's peaceful. Thanks for listening, really. You've just spent time in the quietest corner of history. And maybe, just maybe, that silence is exactly what we needed. So close your eyes, breathe. Let it all fade into the sound of distant howls, slow and steady. Good night from Alaska. And good night from the Wolfman.